Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Cropper here. On the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I have just a little bit here, a total of 2.5 pages, which all concerns the end of the Second World War. And we're going to talk and quote freely from it here. Quote, "During the last years of the war, there was a wave of German war criminals who were selected from the prisoner of war camps and transferred by court verdict to the jurisdiction of the gulags." So we're just going to be going over all the groups that were put into the gulags and how and what and some things about it. In 1945, even though the war with Japan didn't last 3 weeks, great numbers of Japanese war prisoners were raked in for urgent construction projects in Siberia and Central Asia, and the same process of selecting war criminals for the Gulag was carried out among them. And it says that they could not have been, these Japanese could not have been sentenced legitimately. It was an act of revenge as well as a means of holding on to manpower. So they're just capturing slaves. At the end of 1944, when the Soviet army entered the Balkans, and especially in 1945 when it reached Central Europe, a wave of Russian émigrés flowed through the channels of the Gulag. So in the 1920s, when there was civil war in Russia, a lot of Russians left. So now, as the Russian army advances, any Russians that they find get arrested and sent back to Russia. So Russian émigrés, people who had emigrated out of Russia and were living outside Russia, if they were encountered by the Red Army, they were arrested and sent back. Most of them were old men who had left at the time of the revolution, but there were also young people who had grown up outside of Russia. So people who had never even been to Russia, but they were just ethnically Russian. They usually dragged off the menfolk, and they left the women and children where they were. It is true that they did not take everyone, but they took all of those who in the course of 25 years had expressed even the mildest political views, or who had expressed them earlier during the revolution. They did not touch those who had lived a purely vegetable existence. Now, exactly how accurate that is we don't know, and it's the government that did it, and the governments are very clumsy. But in principle, if you were just some housewife who could barely read, you weren't a problem. But if you were any type of intellectual for or against the communists in any way, you were under arrest and put in the Gulag. In 1945, a wave of émigrés poured from Manchuria as well. So Russians who had left in that direction also came back. Some of them were not arrested immediately. Get this is chilling. So the Soviet government said to families, they said, return to the homeland, you can come back as free people. You know, they'd get their train fares, they'd come back, they'd come to the city, they'd think they're coming back from the hellish existence in Manchuria into an industrialized nation again. And they're immediately arrested and separated and sent into exile or into prison. So, now I'm going to skip down to a subnote, a footnote here. It's surprising that in the West, let me read this next paragraph so we know where we're at. Along with them were seized not less than 1 million fugitives from the Soviet government, civilians of all ages of both sexes who had been fortunate enough to find their shelter on Allied territory, but who in 1946 and 47 were perfidiously returned by Allied authorities into Soviet hands. Now that is like when we had the slave repatriation thing in the United States, and black people were just arrested summarily throughout the North and given right back to the South. And some of them weren't even from the South. You know, and they were just called an escaped slave. The South would come with a warrant and say, we have an escaped slave, and the North would arrest a black guy and give it to him. And that is what happened here in Western Europe. In 1946 and 47, a year and 2 years after the war was over, British and American police officers and MPs were arresting Russians and giving them to Stalin's government for Stalin to put into the gulags, of course. Now here's the footnote. It is surprising that in the West, where political secrets cannot be kept long since they inevitably come out in print or are disclosed, the secret of this particular act of betrayal has been very well and carefully kept by the British and American governments. This is truly the last secret, or one of the last, of the Second World War. Having often encountered these people in camps, I was unable to believe for a whole quarter century that the public in the West knew nothing of this action of the Western governments, this massive handing over of ordinary Russian people to retribution and death. Not until 1973, in the Sunday Oklahoma of January 21st, was an article published. And I skip a little bit. They were mainly simple peasants with bitter personal grievances against the Bolsheviks. So it was mostly peasants that left Russia during the revolution, their farms were taken, destroyed, their families were shot and killed and imprisoned and stuff, and they left Russia. These were the people who were arrested by the Western governments and sent back, given back to Soviet governments. The English authorities gave them the treatment, quote, reserved in the case of every other nation for war criminals alone, that of being handed over against their will to captors who incidentally were not expected to give them a fair trial. So we knew as we handed them over that no fair trial was going to be given to these people. They were all sent to destruction in the archipelago. Well, isn't that a terrible thing? Did you know we took part in the Gulag archipelago to this extent? Now, I just have a couple more tidbits here and we'll be done. Against the background of this enormous post-war displacement of millions of people, few paid much attention to small waves such as, and then he names 2 waves of people that went into the Gulag, just massive lumps of people. Wave number 1 in 46 and 47, Soviet girls who went out with foreigners. So during 46 and 47, during 41 to 45, there were a lot of foreigners in Russia for various reasons. And of course, some of the girls dated them. If they did, they now were arrested. They sentenced these girls under Article 735, socially dangerous elements. The second group, Spanish children. The same children who had been taken from their homeland during the Spanish Civil War. You know that Stalin helped fight the fascists in up to 37 or something like that in Spain, but who were adults by the end of the Second World War. So now this is 10 years later, so any little kid now is an adult. Raised in our boarding schools, they nonetheless fitted very poorly into our life. Many longed to go home. They were given 735, socially dangerous element, and those who were particularly stubborn got 58-6, espionage on behalf of America. They were sentenced, sent to the Gulag, and very likely died there. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you know, there's lots and lots of videos up about it. I liked that particular section. It's just concerning the end of World War II, and it shows just the heinous nature of the brutal, careless nature of who they raked in. Any group that could be defined virtually. Any time you could set a definition for a group, you would set that definition and arrest that group. If you read this book, you might do what I did when I originally read these books. It's a 3-volume set. I started having nightmares of people banging at the door at night, so I couldn't finish reading them back then. But there's lots of videos up and stuff about this now. I just thought that I would let you know about this particularly heinous event.